Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the dust and din of a medieval battlefield, but not in the way Hollywood loves to show it. Forget the gleaming armor and heroic charges. We're going for the gritty, the boring, the utterly unglamorous truth of what actually happened. You're not a valiant knight. You're probably just some guy with a pointy stick, shivering in the pre-dawn chill, hoping you don't accidentally stab yourself. Imagine the biting wind whipping across an open field, carrying the scent of damp earth and unwashed bodies. You can hear the nervous shuffle of hundreds, maybe thousands, of men around you, the occasional clink of ill-fitting armor, and the soft, rhythmic snorts of horses. The air is thick with anticipation, but it's less about glory and more about the desperate hope that you'll still have all your limbs by sunset. You're standing there, barely able to see your breath, let alone the person next to you, thanks to the lingering pre-dawn gloom. The ground beneath your worn boots is probably muddy, maybe frozen solid depending on the season, and certainly uneven. This isn't some manicured lawn. It's a field, probably recently plowed, full of divots and hidden stones just waiting to twist an ankle. You can feel the weight of your cheap, perhaps inherited, padded jack or leather jerkin, maybe a rusty iron helmet that smells faintly of old sweat. Your weapon, likely a spear or a simple axe, feels both too heavy and too flimsy in your trembling hands. You've probably eaten some stale bread and a bit of dried meat, or maybe nothing at all, before this long, cold wait. The fear in your gut isn't the heroic sort. It's a cold, knotting dread, the kind that makes you want to curl up and pretend you're back home, arguing with your neighbor about a runaway pig. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's always wild to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As the faintest sliver of light begins to creep over the horizon, painting the eastern sky in dull grays and mauves, the sounds around you shift. The nervous coughs become more frequent, the whispers grow a little louder. You adjust your grip on your spear, feeling the rough wood against your calloused palm. This isn't the charge of the Light Brigade. It's more like a particularly unpleasant Monday morning, but with sharp objects. The medieval battle, you see, was less a glorious ballet of steel and more a drawn-out, confused brawl. One of the mainstream historical facts often overlooked is how few truly decisive, single-day pitched battles there actually were. Most medieval warfare was a tedious affair of sieges, raids, and maneuvering, with battles only occurring when one side was cornered or felt overwhelmingly confident. You might imagine bugles blaring and trumpets sounding, but often, the pre-battle communication was far more rudimentary. Perhaps a loud shout from a commander trying to get everyone facing the right direction, or the rhythmic beat of a drum to set a pace that no one would actually maintain once the fighting started. A quirky tidbit: some medieval armies actually had specific bathroom break calls before battle, understanding that a nervous bladder could be a real tactical disadvantage. Imagine trying to explain that to your grandkids. Yes, son, before we charged, we all had a little moment. It's less dramatic, but certainly more practical. Historians still argue whether the pre-battle prayers were genuinely devout or simply a psychological tool to calm the troops, or perhaps a bit of both. You, however, are probably just praying your armor doesn't fall off mid-sprint, or that you don't trip over a hidden rabbit hole. The real fight, for many, was simply making it to the actual fighting. As the light strengthens, painting the distant trees in shades of murky green and brown, the truly cumbersome process of forming up begins. You might imagine lines of soldiers snapping to attention, perfectly aligned by some unseen hand, but that's pure fantasy. In reality, it was a messy, sprawling affair, like herding very confused, very heavily armed, and very grumpy cats. Units, if you could even call them that in the modern sense, would mill about, trying to find their designated spot in what was often a sprawling, ill-defined battle line. You're jostled by the man to your left, who seems to have an unhealthy obsession with personal space, or rather, a complete lack thereof. His breath, smelling faintly of stale ale, brushes your cheek. You instinctively recoil, but there's nowhere to go. Commanders, mounted on their equally nervous horses, would gallop back and forth, shouting orders that were likely lost in the general hubbub. Imagine trying to get 1,000 people, most of whom have never seen battle, to stand in a straight line while simultaneously dealing with a bladder full of pre-battle jitters. It's less a parade ground drill and more like a particularly disorganized school sports day, but with far higher stakes. The noise, initially a low hum, starts to rise. The murmur of hundreds of voices, the clatter of weapons, the impatient whinnies of horses, and the occasional frustrated yell from a sergeant who's clearly had enough. Your position might be in the first rank, the pointy end of the formation, or further back, where the fear is slightly less immediate, but the anxiety of waiting is perhaps even worse. If you're a spearman, you're trying to keep your long pole from tangling with your neighbors, all while peering through the increasing light for any sign of the enemy. The ground is still a problem. Uneven terrain meant that a perfectly straight line was impossible. Instead, you'd have undulating waves of men, some pushed forward, others falling back, all trying to maintain a semblance of order. Historians still argue whether these formations were truly solid blocks or more fluid arrangements, constantly shifting under pressure. It's one of those things where the written accounts rarely match the practical realities. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is the sheer amount of time it took to get an army ready for battle. We see movies where armies just appear, fully formed, on a hilltop. In reality, it could take hours, even most of a morning, for thousands of men to move from their camp, cross a river, or simply line up on the chosen battlefield. Imagine setting your alarm for 3 a.m. just to spend 4 hours shuffling around in the cold, waiting for someone to finally blow a horn that signals more waiting. And a quirky tidbit, some medieval commanders would intentionally make their formations look larger than they were by spreading their troops out thinly, hoping to intimidate the enemy. It was the medieval equivalent of trying to look buff by wearing a padded jacket. You might even be part of one of these padded jacket units, feeling distinctly unbuff and rather exposed. The sun finally clears the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the field. You can now see the enemy, a distant, shimmering mass, perhaps a mile or two away. They look less like a fearsome horde and more like a slightly blurry smudge on the landscape. You can't make out details, but the sheer number is daunting. Your throat feels dry, and you swallow, trying to dislodge the lump of fear that has taken up residence there. The sounds intensify again, the rhythmic thumping of drums from the enemy lines, the occasional, almost mournful, call of a horn. This is it. The waiting is nearly over, and the real boring, messy stuff is about to begin. You just hope your boots don't get stuck in the mud when the time comes to actually move. With the sun now fully up, casting a weak, watery light over the assembled masses, your attention turns, perhaps unconsciously, to the tools of the trade, weapons and armor. Forget the gleaming, perfectly fitted plate armor you see in movies. For most, it was a far more practical and often uncomfortable affair. You're likely wearing a padded jack, layers of linen or wool stuffed with rags, offering decent protection against glancing blows, but doing little against a direct stab. Or maybe you're lucky enough to have a leather jerkin, boiled and hardened, which is better than nothing. Above that, if you're truly fortunate, you might have a simple mail coif or a bassinet helmet, a relatively light, pointed helm that offers some skull protection but leaves your face exposed to all the unpleasantness heading your way. The weight is considerable. Even a basic kit of padded armor, a helmet, and a shield could easily weigh you down, making every movement a deliberate effort. Imagine trying to run a marathon while wearing a weighted vest and a bicycle helmet that keeps slipping over your eyes. Not exactly agile, are you? This isn't about looking heroic, it's about not dying immediately. A mainstream historical fact is that full plate armor, the iconic knightly suit, only really became common much later in the medieval period, primarily for very wealthy, high-status individuals. For the vast majority of soldiers, it was far more rudimentary and often scavenged or poorly maintained. Your weapon is probably a spear, perhaps 8 to 10 feet long, with a simple iron head. It's cheap, effective, and relatively easy to use. You hold it not with reverence, but with a weary familiarity, like an old broom that gets the job done. Or perhaps you wield an axe, heavy and solid, designed for crushing blows. Swords, the romanticized weapons of legend. were actually quite rare on the battlefield for the common soldier. They were expensive to make, required significant training to wield effectively, and were often relegated to higher-ranking individuals. It's like owning a sports car when all you need is a reliable minivan, impractical for the everyday grind. A quirky tidbit: some soldiers would actually paint their shields with grotesque faces or symbols, not for identification, but to try and intimidate the enemy. Imagine staring across the field and seeing 1,000 distorted, angry faces glaring back at you. Probably wouldn't make you feel any better about the situation, but it's a thought, right? And historians still argue whether the effectiveness of these simple weapons lay more in their individual lethality or in their combined psychological impact as a unified front. Was it the spear itself, or the wall of spears, that truly mattered? As you shift your weight, trying to ease the ache in your shoulders, you can hear the faint thud of the enemy's drums growing louder, a steady, unsettling rhythm that seems to vibrate through the damp ground. Your armor, if you have any, probably pinches in awkward places, and your helmet, if it's too loose, might clank against your head with every nervous twitch. This isn't a fashion show, it's a survival kit, and a pretty uncomfortable one at that. You might even find yourself wishing you'd opted for that slightly too small, but snugger helmet back in the armory. Regrets, you have a few, but none more pressing than your ill-fitting headwear. Now that you're somewhat and uncomfortably dressed for the occasion, the next stage of this grand military spectacle, or rather, the grand military shuffle, begins: the march. You might envision a proud, purposeful advance, banners flapping, drums beating a triumphant rhythm. The reality is far less inspiring. You are now part of a slow, often agonizingly tedious procession across uneven, probably muddy, and definitely unpicturesque terrain. Each step is a conscious effort, your heavy boots sinking into soft earth or sliding on slick grass. The weight of your gear, which felt merely uncomfortable moments ago, now feels like an invisible hand pressing down on your shoulders. You trudge forward, your gaze fixed on the back of the person in front of you, a shuffling silhouette against the pale morning sky. Communication is minimal. Shouts from commanders echo faintly, often unintelligible over the general rustle and groan of thousands of men moving as one ill-coordinated mass. You probably haven't had enough water, and the dry taste in your mouth is compounded by the dust kicked up by hundreds of marching feet. It's a bit like a very long, very boring hike with an extremely rude camping group, except at the end, someone might try to stab you. A mainstream historical fact often glossed over is the sheer logistical nightmare of moving a medieval army. These weren't crack modern divisions with supply trucks and paved roads. Every single item, food, water, weapons, tents, even fodder for the horses, had to be carried or pulled by animals. Imagine trying to coordinate feeding thousands of people for days, or even weeks, on the move, without refrigeration. It was a constant struggle against starvation, disease, and desertion. You're just one small cog in this inefficient machine, feeling every ounce of that inefficiency in your aching feet. Your progress is dictated by the slowest man, or the most difficult patch of ground. You might stop suddenly, causing a ripple effect down the line, then start again just as abruptly. This isn't a quick, decisive movement. It's a slow, inevitable crawl towards confrontation. A quirky tidbit: medieval armies often had to forage as they went, meaning they essentially lived off the land, taking food and supplies from local villages whether the inhabitants liked it or not. This made armies incredibly unpopular wherever they went, turning what might have been a hostile local population into an actively vengeful one. Not exactly great PR, but very practical for survival. Historians still argue whether this foraging was a calculated military strategy or simply a desperate necessity born of poor planning. You, however, are probably just hoping one of those foraged chickens finds its way into your mess tin. The landscape itself is your enemy as much as the opposing army. You might be crossing a small stream, the cold water seeping into your boots, or struggling up a gentle slope, your muscles burning. The whole process is designed to wear you down before you even see the whites of their eyes. And as the distance between your army and the enemy slowly, almost imperceptibly, closes, a new tension settles over the ranks. The anticipation that began at dawn now sharpens into a keen edge. You're tired, thirsty, and frankly, a bit annoyed. The boredom of the march, however, is about to be replaced by something far more stimulating, though perhaps not in a good way. The long, slow march has finally brought you to a point where the enemy is no longer a blurry smudge, but a discernible mass of humanity, shimmering faintly under the now brighter morning sun. This is where the first contact often begins, not with a grand, unified charge, but with the tentative, often frustrating dance of the skirmishers. You're not one of them. Thankfully, their job is to provoke, to harass, to make themselves annoying targets while trying to whittle down the enemy's patience in numbers. Imagine dozens, perhaps hundreds, of individuals breaking away from the main lines, darting forward, loosing arrows or throwing javelins, then scrambling back to safety. It's less a coordinated assault and more like a very dangerous game of tag. You hear the distinct thwip of arrows cutting through the air, the dull thud as some find their mark, and the occasional shouted curse. This is the background noise of the battle's opening act, a nervous preamble to the main event. For you, standing in the main battle line, it's a period of intense waiting, a feeling like being a spectator at a very slow, very high-stakes tennis match where the ball is occasionally an arrow with your name on it. A mainstream historical fact is that skirmishing was a crucial, though often unglamorous, part of medieval warfare. It wasn't about winning the battle outright, but about gaining a psychological edge, testing enemy formations, and creating casualties before the main engagement. These skirmishers were typically lightly armed, often archers, slingers, or javelin throwers, chosen for their speed and agility rather than their ability to stand in a line and take a hit. They were the annoyances, the mosquitoes buzzing around the giants. You watch, perhaps gripping your spear a little tighter, as an enemy arrow sails harmlessly over your head, burying itself in the soft earth behind you with a faint whiz. It's a sobering reminder that even from a distance, death can find you. A quirky tidbit about skirmishers is that some would deliberately taunt the enemy with insults and gestures, trying to draw them out of their formation or simply to raise their own side's morale. Imagine risking your life just to call someone's mother a goat herder. Brave, or just incredibly foolish. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of skirmishing was to inflict casualties or simply to probe the enemy's strengths and weaknesses before the main clash. It's a fine line between reconnaissance and simply being a nuisance. The skirmishing might last for minutes, or even an hour or more, gradually escalating the tension. Each time an arrow flies, or a javelin lands with a wet thud, a ripple of anxiety passes through your ranks. You shift your weight, perhaps adjusting your helmet, trying to get comfortable in the uncomfortable waiting. The sun is higher now, and the air is warming, but you still feel a chill, a pervasive coldness that has nothing to do with the weather. The field, which moments ago seemed empty save for your own forces, is now dotted with the small, desperate movements of these light troops, a grim dance of dodge and strike. And you know, deep down, that this is just the overture. The main act, the truly boring and brutal part, is still to come. As the skirmishing continues, a new, more pervasive sound begins to dominate the field. The rhythmic, almost hypnotic thrum of bowstrings. This is where the archers come into their own, or at least, where they try to. You're now subjected to the chilling prospect of a rain of arrows. But let's be honest, it's rarely the cinematic deluge you see in the movies. Instead, it's a more sporadic, yet equally terrifying, shower of pointy sticks. You hear the high-pitched whistle as they cut through the air, followed by the sickening thump as they embed themselves in the earth, or worse, in flesh. You instinctively duck your head, pulling your shield, if you have one, a little closer. This is less about heroic defiance and more about primal self-preservation. Each arrow represents a tiny, incredibly fast possibility of your immediate demise. Imagine trying to dodge 1,000 tiny, angry needles fired by unseen hands. It's an exhausting mental game, constantly calculating trajectories and bracing for impact. A mainstream historical fact about medieval archery is that while formidable, it wasn't always the decisive, battle-winning force often portrayed. The effectiveness of archers depended heavily on factors like ammunition supply, enemy armor, weather conditions, and the terrain. A strong headwind could render longbows almost useless for accurate shots, and even a well-aimed arrow might bounce harmlessly off a decent piece of armor. The sheer volume of arrows was often more about psychological impact and disorganization than immediate mass slaughter. A quirky tidbit: some medieval archers would actually collect spent arrows from the battlefield during lulls, especially if their own supply was running low. It's like a grim, deadly scavenger hunt, hoping to find a reusable projectile before someone finds you. And historians still argue whether the English longbow or the continental crossbow was the more devastating weapon on the medieval battlefield, each having distinct advantages and disadvantages in terms of rate of fire, penetration, and training requirements. You, however, are probably less interested in scholarly debate and more interested in not becoming a pincushion. The sound of the arrows is relentless, a constant drone that wears on your nerves. You see men around you flinch, some cry out as an arrow finds its mark, puncturing skin or, in some horrifying cases, finding an eye or a throat. The wounded fall, screaming, or simply lie still. There's no dramatic music, just the raw, visceral sounds of pain and fear. There's a strange, almost absurd, humor in the situation. You're standing here, potentially about to die, and all you can think about is how much you hate the whistle of those damned arrows. It's like the world's most aggressive buzzing mosquito, but instead of an itch, it leaves a hole. You're trying to keep your eyes forward, scanning the enemy lines, but every fiber of your being wants to shrink, to make yourself as small as possible. The ground around you starts to look like a pincushion, bristling with fletched shafts. The air, already thick with tension, now carries the metallic tang of fear and a faint, acrid smell of fresh blood. The rain of death might be a bit of an exaggeration, but a persistent drizzle of discomfort, fear, and sharp objects? Absolutely. Suddenly, the steady thrum of the archers is pierced by a new sound, a rising crescendo of thunderous hooves and clanking steel, the cavalry charge. This is often presented as the decisive, awe-inspiring moment of medieval battle, a glorious wave of steel sweeping all before it. The reality, from your perspective on the ground, is more akin to a very fast, very large, and very terrifying stampede heading directly for your face. You hear the ground vibrate, a deep, resonant rumble that starts in your feet and works its way up to your teeth. You brace yourself, instinctively lowering your spear, pointing its tip towards the oncoming mass of horse and rider. The horses themselves are a magnificent, terrifying blur, their muscles straining, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with the adrenaline of the charge. Their riders, often knights or wealthier men-at-arms, are a blur of color and metal, their lances held steady, aimed with deadly intent. This isn't a graceful ballet. It's an explosion of power and momentum, designed to shatter the fragile human wall of infantry. A mainstream historical fact is that while visually impressive, cavalry charges rarely broke well-ordered infantry formations head-on. The sheer impact was immense, certainly, but a dense block of spearmen or pikemen, with their long, bristling weapons, could often halt a charge or force it to peel away. Horses, for all their power, are still animals, and they are instinctively reluctant to impale themselves on a wall of sharpened steel. It's like trying to get a particularly stubborn cat to walk into a really pointy bush. A quirky tidbit: some medieval cavalrymen would actually tie bells or other noisemakers to their horses' bridles or armor, not just for show, but to amplify the psychological impact of their charge. Imagine the thundering hooves combined with a jangling symphony of fear. It's less about precision and more about overwhelming sensory assault. And historians still argue whether the primary role of medieval cavalry was to deliver a direct shattering blow or to exploit weaknesses in the enemy line once the infantry engagement had begun. Were they battering rams or opportunistic predators? You, however, are probably just hoping they peel away quickly. As they draw closer, you can almost feel the wind of their passage, smell the sweat of the horses, hear the desperate cries of the riders as they commit to the impact. The sound of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of heavy animals thundering towards you is deafening, a roar that drowns out all other thoughts. There's a brief, terrifying moment where it feels like they will simply ride over you, crushing you into the earth. Then, the inevitable happens, the clatter of steel against steel, the whinny of a wounded horse, the shouts and grunts of men in close combat. The charge either hits home, causing a horrifying ripple of destruction, or it veers off, the cavalry flowing around the unyielding infantry block like water around a stone. You might even see a rider or horse fall, tumbling in a sickening heap, a stark reminder of the risks involved. You're holding your breath, your muscles rigid, anticipating the impact or the blessed relief of its bypass. Whether the cavalry charge broke upon your lines or merely swept past, the inevitable now looms, the infantry push. This is where the real grind begins, the unglamorous, exhausting work of hand-to-hand combat in a densely packed formation. You are no longer watching. You are participating, a tiny cog in a very large, very slow-moving meat grinder. The initial impact, if it happens, is less a dramatic clash and more a jarring, collective shove. Imagine a crowd at a concert, but everyone is heavily armed and deeply unhappy. You're pushed forward, then back, then sideways, utterly at the mercy of the collective momentum of your comrades and the enemy. The air, already thick with dust and the metallic tang of fear, now fills with the grunts, shouts, and screams of men locked in a desperate struggle. The sounds of metal on metal are constant. The dull thud of a shield taking a blow, the sharp clang of a sword striking a helmet, the sickening squelch of a blade finding flesh. You're trying to keep your spear pointed, trying to find a gap in the enemy's defenses, but the sheer press of bodies makes any elegant maneuver impossible. This is about brute force, endurance, and a terrifying amount of luck. A mainstream historical fact often obscured by romantic tales is that infantry engagements were rarely swift, decisive affairs. They were often prolonged, attritional struggles where lines slowly pushed and pulled, sometimes for hours. It was a contest of stamina and morale as much as skill. Imagine being stuck in a perpetually moving mosh pit, but every accidental elbow could be a sword. And a quirky tidbit: some medieval soldiers would carry small pouches of sand or dirt to throw in an opponent's eyes, a truly ignoble but surprisingly effective tactic in the chaotic press of battle. It's the original dirty trick. Historians still argue whether the concept of a push of pike or shield wall was a literal physical shove or a more symbolic term for the relentless pressure exerted by massed infantry. You, however, are feeling every single ounce of that pressure. You might be jammed so tightly against your comrades that you can barely move your weapon. Your thrusts are short, desperate jabs. You're not aiming for a killing blow every time. You're just trying to keep the enemy from killing you. Sweat streams down your face, stinging your eyes, mixing with the dust and grime. Your muscles ache, your breath comes in ragged gasps. Every swing, every parry, every step backward or forward demands immense physical effort. You can feel the collective will of the lines, the ebb and flow of the struggle, as one side gains a few feet, only to lose them again. The boredom of the march and the terror of the missile barrage are replaced by a raw, overwhelming exhaustion. You're not fighting a single enemy hero. You're fighting a faceless, pressing mass, and all you can do is survive the next moment. As the infantry push intensifies, the fighting coalesces into the terrifying reality of the melee. This isn't a series of one-on-one duels. It's a chaotic, claustrophobic, and disorienting struggle in a heaving mass of bodies. You are no longer part of a neat line. You are caught in a swirling vortex of flailing limbs, desperate shouts, and the sickening sounds of close-quarters violence. The world shrinks to the immediate few feet around you, a blur of faces, weapons, and desperate movements. Visibility is terrible. The dust kicked up by thousands of feet and the sheer press of bodies mean you can barely see past the person immediately in front of you. You might recognize a comrade's voice or catch a glimpse of their familiar shield design, but distinguishing friend from foe can become incredibly difficult in the dense press. This is where individual skill is often secondary to sheer endurance and the ability to keep your head. You might be knocked off balance by a surge of bodies or tripped by a fallen comrade, instantly putting you at a terrible disadvantage. A mainstream historical fact is that the average engagement time for an individual in a medieval battle was far shorter than often imagined. While battles could last for hours, individual soldiers often only survived for minutes, or even seconds, in the thickest of the melee. It was less about prolonged fighting and more about rapid, brutal exchanges. Imagine trying to fight for your life in a packed elevator, except everyone has sharp objects and no concept of personal space. And a quirky tidbit: some medieval soldiers would carry small, sharp knives or daggers specifically for use in the melee, where a long weapon might be unwieldy. These merciful daggers were sometimes used to dispatch a severely wounded opponent, or even to perform a quick act of violence through the visor of a knight's helmet. Grim, but efficient. Historians still argue whether the high casualty rates in medieval melees were due to superior individual fighting prowess, or simply the sheer, overwhelming chaos and inability to defend oneself properly. You're definitely feeling the chaos. The sounds are overwhelming. The ragged shouts of war cries, the gasps of pain, the clang of steel, the dull thud of blows landing, and the sickening crunch of bones. You might even hear the desperate gurgle of a man whose throat has been cut, a sound that will haunt your nightmares for weeks, assuming you survive to have nightmares. You might be fighting an enemy for mere seconds before someone else pushes you, or them, aside, throwing you into a new, equally desperate confrontation. There's no strategy here, just reactive, primal survival. Your weapon feels heavy, slick with sweat, and perhaps something else. You're constantly assessing, constantly reacting. A blow from the left, a lunge from the right. You parry clumsily, or maybe your shield takes the brunt of it. Your arms ache, your breathing is ragged, and your vision blurs from exertion and fear. It's a terrifying dance with death, performed in the tightest of quarters. You might lose your footing, stumble, and for a terrifying second, you're looking up at the sky, surrounded by stamping boots and flashing steel. It's not glorious, it's just desperate, terrifying, and utterly exhausting. In the heart of that swirling, chaotic melee, one thing becomes painfully clear. Command and control are utterly impossible. Forget the valiant general directing the flow of battle from a hilltop. Once the lines clashed, the entire engagement devolved into a series of localized, desperate fights. You hear the occasional shout of a sergeant or a captain, a desperate plea to hold the line or push forward, but their voices are swallowed by the roar of the conflict. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra during a hurricane. You are effectively on your own, operating within the immediate few feet around you, making split-second decisions based purely on survival. The grand strategy of the commanders, whatever it might have been, is irrelevant now. Your personal strategy boils down to don't get hit, and try to hit them. There's no way for a leader far behind the lines to know that your small section is buckling under pressure, or that a breakthrough is happening just a few yards to your left. Messages, if they could even be sent, would take too long to arrive and would be hopelessly outdated by the time they did. A mainstream historical fact is that effective communication on a medieval battlefield was almost non-existent once the fighting started. Hand signals, shouted orders, and runners were the primary methods, all of which were incredibly unreliable in the noise and confusion. Imagine trying to explain complex tactical maneuvers to someone 20 feet away when 1,000 people are screaming and clanging swords. It's less like a military operation and more like a very aggressive, very loud game of charades. And a quirky tidbit: some medieval commanders would bring musicians, drummers, and trumpeters onto the battlefield, not just for morale, but as an attempt to transmit simple signals, like advance or retreat. Though, honestly, you'd be hard-pressed to hear a solo flute over the sound of 1,000 men trying to kill each other. Historians still argue whether the lack of precise command and control contributed more to the high casualty rates or to the off-installed nature of medieval battles, where neither side could gain a decisive advantage for long. You, meanwhile, are just trying to keep your head attached. You might glance over and see your immediate superior, perhaps a local lord or knight, fighting just as desperately as you are, their face grim beneath their helmet. But they are as isolated as you are, making their own desperate choices. There's no overarching plan unfolding before your eyes. There's just the immediate threat, the immediate parry, the immediate thrust. It's a terrifyingly democratic kind of chaos, where everyone is equally overwhelmed. The noise is a physical presence, a vibrating wall of sound that seems to press in on you from all sides. You might feel a wave of despair wash over you as a section of your line gives way, or a surge of grim hope as the enemy recoils. But these are fleeting moments, as the chaotic nature of the melee means nothing is stable for long. You're a single drop in a turbulent ocean, tossed about by forces you can neither see nor comprehend. The notion of a general calmly directing their forces is a comforting myth. The reality is that everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest lord, is just trying not to get cleaved in half. The sustained pressure, the exhaustion, the sheer impossibility of effective command. All these factors contribute to the inevitable breaking point, panic and rout. It rarely happens all at once, like some dramatic movie collapse. Instead, it's a terrifying, almost imperceptible erosion of morale, a subtle shift that then cascades into outright flight. You might first notice it as a slight hesitation in the enemy's push, or a sudden, desperate backward step by a few men in their ranks. Then, it's a trickle, a few individuals turning and running, then a stream, and finally, a terrifying flood. The transformation from fighting formation to panic mob is shockingly swift. 1 minute, you are locked in a desperate struggle. The next, the collective will of the enemy, or your own side, shatters. The sound changes, too. The coordinated grunts and shouts give way to individual screams of terror, the thud of running feet, and the panicked cries of men trying to escape. Your own heart pounds in your chest, a drumbeat of primal fear. Do you join them? Do you hold your ground? The instinct for self-preservation is overwhelmingly powerful. A mainstream historical fact about medieval battles is that the vast majority of casualties occurred during the rout, not during the main melee. Once an army broke, men would shed their heavy armor and weapons to run faster, making them incredibly vulnerable to pursuit by cavalry or even faster-moving infantry. It was less about valiant last stands and more about a brutal, often messy, slaughter of fleeing individuals. Imagine trying to run a sprint while wearing a cumbersome backpack, and someone is chasing you with a very sharp stick. And a quirky tidbit: some medieval armies would deliberately employ false retreats to try and trick the enemy into breaking formation and pursuing them, only to turn and ambush the disorganized pursuers. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy that often resulted in absolute disaster if not executed perfectly. Historians still argue whether a rout was more often caused by physical exhaustion or a sudden psychological collapse of morale. You, however, are probably just calculating the fastest escape route. The sight of men breaking ranks and fleeing is contagious. Fear, like a medieval plague, spreads through the formation. You might see a once stoic comrade suddenly drop his shield and sprint away, leaving a gaping hole in the line. The enemy, sensing weakness, surges forward with renewed ferocity, their war cries no longer desperate but triumphant. Your own side begins to crumble around you. The disciplined fighting gives way to individual acts of desperation. Someone might trip over a fallen body, their cries cut short as an enemy weapon descends. This isn't glorious defeat. It's a messy, undignified scramble for survival. The field, which was once a stage for battle, becomes a deadly obstacle course. You're weaving between panicked bodies, trying to avoid stray blows from friend and foe alike. Your only goal to put as much distance as possible between yourself and the horrifying chaos. The wind, which once carried the scent of damp earth, now carries the distinct, metallic tang of blood and the pervasive stench of fear. You are no longer a soldier. You are simply a runner, hoping to outpace the inevitable. Whether you managed to escape the rout or were among the victorious pursuers, the immediate aftermath of a medieval battle is a grim and sobering tableau. The sounds of combat slowly fade, replaced by a new symphony of despair. The moans of the wounded, the cries of the dying, and the often eerie silence that settles over a field where thousands of lives have just been irrevocably altered. You are standing amidst the detritus of conflict, the very ground beneath your feet soaked with blood and littered with broken weapons, discarded armor, and the crumpled forms of the dead and severely injured. Your adrenaline, which kept you going through the panic and the melee, begins to recede, leaving you with a crushing exhaustion and a gnawing hollowness in your gut. This isn't the glorious end of a heroic tale, it's just the messy, ugly reality. A mainstream historical fact is that medical care on a medieval battlefield was practically non-existent. Wounds that would be treatable today were often death sentences. Infection was rampant, and even a minor cut could become fatal. Imagine the desperate pleas for water, the agonizing sounds of men bleeding out, and the chilling finality of stillness. You might be tasked with walking the field, searching for your own wounded comrades, or perhaps retrieving equipment. Each step is carefully placed, avoiding the twisted limbs and vacant stares of the fallen. The expressions on the faces of the dead are not of heroic defiance, but often of agony, surprise, or simply blank emptiness. A quirky tidbit is that some medieval surgeons, if they were even present, would use hot irons to cauterize wounds, a brutal but sometimes effective way to stop bleeding. Imagine the smell of burning flesh mingling with the coppery scent of blood. It's less about healing and more about desperate, painful intervention. Historians still argue whether the psychological trauma inflicted on medieval soldiers by witnessing such scenes was as significant as the physical wounds, often leading to what we might now call a form of PTSD. The sun, now higher in the sky, casts long, stark shadows across the silent field, highlighting the brutal efficiency of human conflict. The air, which moments ago was filled with the roar of battle, now hangs heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the sweet, sickly smell of fresh death. Flies, already attracted by the carnage, begin to buzz. This is not a scene for poets. It's a scene for scavengers and the lucky few who survived. You might see small groups of men, friends, or family, frantically searching among the bodies, hoping against hope to find a loved one still breathing, or at least to identify their remains. The cries of grief mingle with the moans of pain. The sheer scale of suffering is overwhelming, a stark contrast to the distant, strategic aims of the commanders who sent these men to their fate. There are no cheering crowds, no triumphant parades here, just the silence of the dead and the quiet despair of the living. As the immediate horror of the battlefield subsides, a new, equally unglamorous activity begins: the collection of spoils. This isn't the glorious acquisition of treasure. It's a grubby, often dangerous, and decidedly unsanitary process of scavenging the dead. You might be ordered to do it, or you might simply join in, driven by the desperate need for anything valuable. Imagine picking through the belongings of the recently deceased, your hands brushing against cold, clammy skin, the smell of blood and bowels heavy in the air. The objective is simple: take anything of value. That might mean a rusty sword, a slightly less battered helmet, a pair of usable boots, or even just the coins jingling in a dead man's pouch. The emphasis is on utility, not grandeur. A mainstream historical fact is that looting was an accepted, even expected, part of medieval warfare, often serving as a primary incentive for soldiers who otherwise received little pay. It was a grim form of combat bonus, but it also meant that the battlefield quickly became a chaotic free-for-all, with men sometimes fighting over the bodies of the recently fallen. You're constantly on edge, not just from the grim task itself, but from the fear of lurking enemies who might still be hiding, or even from fellow scavengers. Morality takes a back seat to survival and opportunity. You might find yourself turning over a body, trying to pry off a ring or unbuckle a piece of armor, your stomach churning, but your resolve firm. A quirky tidbit: some desperate looters would even pull teeth from the dead, as gold fillings, or even just sound teeth could be sold to dentists or apothecaries. Imagine the grim determination required for that particular task. Historians still argue whether the practice of battlefield scavenging led to increased brutality in medieval warfare, as some might have been tempted to kill rather than wound to ensure a richer haul. The ground becomes even more churned up, now by the movement of the living searching among the dead. The cries of the wounded, if any still remain, are often ignored in the mad scramble for loot. There's a sickening efficiency to it, a desensitization that comes from being surrounded by so much death. You might even find yourself stripping the armor from an enemy you just fought, perhaps even the one you killed, a chillingly personal connection to the grim reality of what you've just done. The spoils themselves are rarely pristine. Armor might be dented, weapons blunted, clothing torn and bloodied. But to a soldier who might have lost his own meager equipment, or who simply needs a few coppers to buy a meal, even damaged goods are valuable. The process is quick, brutal, and essential. You don't linger, you don't reflect. You simply take what you can and move on, hoping to find something that will make the next few days or weeks a little easier. The sun continues its slow arc across the sky, casting a stark, uncompromising light on this final, unpleasant act of the battle. With the immediate horrors of battle and the grim task of scavenging behind you, the focus shifts to the less dramatic but equally crucial aspects of medieval warfare, the logistics of war. You're not fighting anymore, but the struggle for survival, for basic comfort, continues. Imagine the sprawling, disorganized chaos of a medieval army camp after a battle, or even on the march. It's a temporary, often squalid city that springs up wherever the army halts, a testament to the immense logistical challenges of sustaining thousands of men and their animals. You're tired, your body aches from head to toe, and you're probably covered in a mixture of dirt, sweat, and perhaps something worse. Your immediate concern is food, water, and a place to rest your weary bones. There are no fancy mess halls. Meals are often meager, consisting of hardtack, dried meat, and whatever meager rations were carried or could be foraged. Imagine trying to cook a meal over a smoky campfire amidst hundreds of other equally hungry, equally exhausted soldiers, the air thick with wood smoke and unwashed bodies. A mainstream historical fact often underestimated is that more soldiers in medieval campaigns died from disease, starvation, or exposure than from actual combat. Dysentery, camp fever, and simple malnutrition were constant, silent killers, far more insidious than any enemy sword. Imagine thousands of men living in close quarters, with rudimentary sanitation at best, sharing contaminated water sources. It was a perfect breeding ground for epidemics. And a quirky tidbit: medieval armies often had to employ an army of camp followers, merchants, prostitutes, servants, blacksmiths, even laundresses, who were crucial for providing services and supplies that the official army logistics couldn't. It was like a mobile, extremely unhygienic marketplace constantly trailing the fighting force. Historians still argue whether the administrative challenges of supplying a medieval army were a greater limiting factor on the scale and duration of campaigns than the actual fighting capabilities of the soldiers themselves. You, however, are probably just hoping for a decent night's sleep. Your shelter might be a simple lean-to made from scavenged branches, or if you're lucky, a shared tent, damp and smelling of mildew. The nights are cold, even in summer, and the ground is hard. Sleep comes fitfully, punctuated by the sounds of the camp, the snorting of horses, the murmur of voices, the distant howl of a wolf, or the cry of a man suffering from his wounds. There's no escaping the pervasive grimness. Even if you escaped the battle unscathed, the constant strain of camp life wears you down. The boredom of endless waiting, the discomfort of poor living conditions, and the ever-present threat of disease are insidious enemies. You might spend days performing mundane tasks, mending equipment, fetching water, digging latrines, all the while anticipating the next order to march, the next potential confrontation. This unseen struggle, the daily battle against the elements and basic survival, is far less dramatic than a charge, but far more persistent. It's the unwritten chapter of every war, the one where everyone is just trying to get by. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting the camp in long, fading shadows, you might find yourself reflecting, however briefly, on the legacy of what you've just experienced, and how little of it will truly be remembered. You are but one of thousands, a fleeting shadow in a much larger, often chaotic, historical event. Most of the men around you, just like you, will never be named in any grand chronicle. Their fears, their bravery, their very existence will fade into the dusty annals of the forgotten. A mainstream historical fact is that the vast majority of those who fought in medieval battles were not knights or nobles, but ordinary peasants and townsmen, conscripted or pressed into service. Their stories, if they were ever recorded, were often lost to time, their individual contributions swallowed by the collective narrative of kings and battles. Imagine working your fields one day, then being handed a rusty spear the next, and then vanishing into the fog of war, your name unwritten, your face unseen by history. It's a humbling, almost melancholy thought. And a quirky tidbit: medieval scribes and chroniclers, often writing long after the fact and from a distance, frequently exaggerated numbers and embellished details to make battles seem more glorious or decisive, often at the expense of accuracy. So even the stories that were told might not be entirely true, turning real human experiences into mere literary devices. Historians still argue whether the anonymity of the common soldier in medieval records reflects a deliberate societal indifference or simply the practical limitations of record-keeping in an age before widespread literacy. You lie on your hard bed, perhaps staring up at the canvas roof of your tent or the vast, indifferent expanse of stars if you're sleeping in the open. The sounds of the camp are quieter now, a low murmur, punctuated by snores and the rustle of straw. You might think of home, of the warmth of a hearth, the familiar scent of your village, the faces of loved ones. These memories are precious, fleeting comforts in a world that has proven itself utterly brutal and unforgiving. Your personal legacy might simply be survival, a return to your farm or workshop, carrying invisible scars that no one else will ever see. The grand narratives of history focus on who won, who lost, and what empires rose or fell. They rarely delve into the aching feet, the gnawing fear, the constant hunger, or the profound exhaustion of the individual who actually lived through it. You are a footnote to a footnote, a silent witness to events that will shape the future, but whose true impact on you will remain unchronicled. The sheer scale of human effort, suffering, and logistical struggle that went into simply putting two armies on a field, having them clash, and then dispersing, is staggering. And yet, for all that effort, for all those lives expended, the details of your experience, the unique blend of terror and boredom, courage and despair, will evaporate like morning mist. You are a ghost of the past, your story unspoken, your presence known only to yourself. It's a strangely comforting thought, in its own way, the freedom of being unburdened by historical significance, to simply exist, and hopefully, to survive another day. The distant campfires now glow like dying embers, a soft, warm flicker against the velvet black of the night sky. The last whispers of conversation have faded, replaced by the gentle rhythm of collective breathing and the subtle hum of the world settling down. Your eyelids feel heavy, a profound weariness seeping into every muscle, every bone. Allow yourself to sink into this deep, peaceful calm. The trials of the battlefield, the dust and the clamor, are far behind you now, softening into indistinct memories, like scenes from a dream. You are safe, warm, and utterly undisturbed. Let the lingering images of the past dissolve, drifting away like smoke on a gentle breeze. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go, save into the welcoming embrace of true rest. Just breathe softly, feel the quiet hush all around you, and let sleep pull you down into its gentle depths, carrying you far away from all worries, into a place of perfect tranquility. End of script. Sweet dreams.